cold open me, Robert.
It's Behind the Bastards still. Podcast, bad people, Margaret Killjoy. Margaret, Helmut Kentler, bad guy. You could call him a kind of like philosopher.
Bastard.
If he was Greek, his name would be Pedophiles.
Robert.
See, that was bad. It was just in my head. You gotta excise this stuff. You just gotta excise this stuff.
You just exist to make guests look bad. I really am impressed.
God. Robert.
I don't know what else can you say? Probably factual things and
Here's
not bad
I'll
jokes
say.
about
Magpie,
Greek pedophiles.
Robert is your guest soon on Cool People Did Cool Stuff.
Yeah.
Start thinking of your revenge.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
As the producer of both podcasts, I will help you.
Well, just to give people a heads up, Robert did an episode about the Ukrainian anarchist Makhno, but I'm going to come in and tell him about the women who also did all that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what you can listen to in a couple weeks.
I'm gonna do a lot of that Borat my wife joke, but in my best Ukrainian accent.
Oh,
we had Matt on a week ago.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Well, damn it. All right, let's get back to the pedophiles. So it's important to understand the intellectual environment in the left in Germany in which all of this shit with Kentler's horrible experimentation happened, because Kentler's pedophile foster program, he is focusing on these kids who are the most deprived and like marginalized people in all of German society, right? These homeless children. But those are not the only kids being victimized or at least experiencing elements of victimization as a result of this like pedophile infiltration of the German left and this kind of conflation of sexual liberation with like child sexual liberation.
Yeah.
So research on all of this is sketchy is not the right word, but it's like it's messy because it's problematically hard to fund any kind of research into pedophilia. But the common answer you'll get is that somewhere around 1% of the population, as like human population, are pedophiles, right? It's kind of probably the high number.
In terms of their like sexual attraction pattern or whatever.
Yes. So that's, a very small number of people, but a lot of Berliners and a lot of members of like the new left in Germany in West Germany are playing a role in institutionalizing pedophilic practices into childcare, a lot more than that 1%. And so these people are doing it not because they themselves are attracted to children, but because they have bought into a specific kind of sexual liberation ideology that guys like Kentler are pushing. A good example of this is the case of Commune 2, a commune formed in the summer of 1967 by 4 men and 3 women in an apartment in a street in Berlin. I am not going to try and pronounce. Yeah, it's Geisbruckstrasse. Maybe I did that okay.
There's a little funny B at the end. That's all I know.
Yeah. So these 4 men and 3 women formed this commune with 2 children, a 3-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy. In 1971, a leftist magazine called Kurzbuch published a full-spread article about Commune 2, and particularly its experimentation in child sexual liberation. In an article for Der Spiegel, Jan Fleischauer wrote, quote, "For the residents, the cohabitation experiment was an attempt to overcome all bourgeoisie constraints, which included everything from separate bank accounts and closed bathroom doors to fidelity within couples and the development of feelings of shame. The 2 children were raised by the group, which often meant no one paid much attention to them, because the adults had made it their goal not just to tolerate, but in fact affirm child sexuality. They were not satisfied to simply act as passive observers." Kurzbuch 17, that's the issue of the magazine, contained a series of poster-sized photos. Under the headline, "Love Play in the Children's Room," it depicted Nessim and Grisha, both naked. The oversized images are of the sort that one would expect to see in a magazine for pedophiles today, certainly not in an influential publication of the leftist intelligentsia. The caption reads, "Grisha walks over to the mirror, looks at her body, bends forward several times, encircling her buttocks with her hands, and says, 'Look, my vagina.'" So what you're seeing here, this is not the same thing that Kentler's doing. It's certainly not as problematic as straight up saying we are handing poor kids to pedophiles because who else will love them. But this is also deeply problematic, right? Now, Fleischauer caught up with a former member of the Commune who talked to her about how these kids had done. This former member told her that Nassim, the boy, felt horror when asked about his time at the Commune. But both he and Grisha seemed to have grown up into functional adults. Neither of them really expressed an interest in talking about their childhood, which is their right. I get the feeling they have a lot of anger, but not in the same way as the kids who were placed with pedophiles. Probably because while the behavior the adults in the Commune engaged in was unacceptable, I don't think it involved actual sex, right?
Okay.
It is enough on that edge, and there are some people who argued for it. It may have. I can't say for certain, right?
Yeah.
This is a lot of these different experiments flirt at the edge of that. And the word flirt is unfortunately literally, it's messy, and we'll never know fully with all of this stuff, right? Commune 2, though, was not an isolated experiment. It was a pilot project in anti-authoritarian living that was seen as so successful, it was followed by other private kindergartens. We talked about how all of these, a lot of whom are like educators and academics, are forming these like private kindergartens, which are basically like communal kindergarteners for groups of leftists with kids to like have their little kids in, right? And these are experiments in anti-authoritarian education. These are designed to break the kind of patterns that Dr. Schreber and Harrer and like the Nazis had put, that we talked about in the first two episodes of this, right?
And there are people who've done this really well. They just don't sleep with the children.
And by the way, not all of these Kinderladens are places where children are slept with, right? I don't think most of them were, but this is not a tiny chunk of them either. Where not even slept with, where child sexual liberation is a topic of like focus for the parents, right?
Okay,
that's more accurate to say what we're talking about here. This is not a case of they're talking like I'm just going to get into the story because this is really messy and complicated, and there's a lot to discuss. So these centers, called Kinderladens, were essentially less extreme than the Commune. They involved groups of parents collaborating and creating a learning space for groups of kids. These were not all the same, but in many cases, weird ideas about sex ed were mixed with reasonable ideas for experimental childcare, attempts to break the notably problematic authoritarian patterns in parenting that had been a part of the Nazi era, right? That had helped feed into it. Parents, one of the things that people would do is like parents would take kids to protests. They would engage children with political education not seen in normal schools. The idea was you should be able to talk with kids about real issues in the world the way you would with an adult, not necessarily hiding this stuff from them, right? Yeah. The downside of that is that there was also this idea that, well, if we're going to treat kids like adults in one way, right?
Right.
Yeah. Alexander Schuller, an influential figure in the Kinderladen movement, claims that sex ed was the topic most discussed when parents would, debate as to how they should structure these things. From Der Spiegel, quote, in 1969, Schuller, a sociologist, was one of the founders of a Kinderladen in Berlin's Wilmersdorf neighborhood. Like Schuller, the other parents were academics, journalists, or university employees, a decidedly upper-middle-class lot. Schuller's two sons, 4 and 5 years old at the time, grew up without the customary rules and punishments of a government-run daycare facility. But the adults were soon divided over the issue of sex. Some were determined to encourage their children to show and touch their genitalia, while the others were horrified by the idea. It was never addressed quite that directly, but it was clear that in the end, sex with 2 female teachers was considered, says Schuller. I found it incredibly difficult to take a stance. I felt that what we were trying to do was fundamentally correct, but when it came to this issue, I thought, this is crazy. This just isn't right. But then I felt ashamed of thinking that way. I think many were in the same position.
It's that justification for it. On a core level, the main thing is just don't do that. Don't abuse people.
Yes.
And then, especially children.
It's when you start centering ideology before centering how you treat people that not just this, but all problems start, right?
Yeah.
And it takes a full year of debate. But thankfully, in this case, the parents who are like, of course they shouldn't sleep with the teachers did win. There was no sex in this Kinderladen. I get the feeling that in this case, the parents who were talking about, like, who were suggesting effectively, like, sexually assaulting, like, that they were ideologically cooked, right? That they felt like this was the most radical thing they could do and that would make them better leftists. Right. I say this because it doesn't sound like, from Schuller's recollection, the teachers wanted to molest these kids, right? Or that the parent who suggested it wanted to watch or participate. They just felt kind of vaguely that the experience would help craft more anti-authoritarian youth. It is madness, right?
Yeah. And you're right about how it's like it's been injected by pedophiles into this movement, and then everyone's like, fuck, do we have to become pedophiles? And then people are like, no,
of course we don't. And thankfully in Schuller's case, the people are like, no, of course not. Do win, right?
Yeah.
And again, somewhere in that scene, in the broader Kinderladen scene, there are real pedophiles consciously trying to craft a world where they can act with impunity. Yeah. An influential educational tool at the time was the Handbook for Positive Child Indoctrination, which is a bad title for a book. This is a 1968 tract that claimed to help parents, quote, create a new person, and argued, children can learn to appreciate eroticism and sexual intercourse long before they are capable of understanding how a child is conceived. It is valuable for children to cuddle with adults. It is no less valuable for sexual intercourse to occur during cuddling. God. And this is part of why I grounded these episodes by talking about how there was for generations this attitude that, like, you do not make any contact with your children other than what is the minimal necessary to maintain their surviving, right? And the reaction to that goes in an equally insane direction, right? Yeah. Like, it's not just, well, of course, parents should, like, hold their kids and express physical affection, but, like, it's fine if sex occurs, right? It's this rubber band effect. If when you go in that insane a direction, it's like you should lock children alone in a room for the first day of their life and never so much as, like, hug them. When you break that, you're going to wind up in an equally damaging place.
And it just, one of the million reasons it's so heartbreaking is that it's like, it destroys the safety. Yeah. The whole point of that affection from a parent. Sorry, I'm trying to get super emotional about it. The whole point of that emotion from the parent should be a non-sexual safety. Yeah. You know, and like showing what care and love are, like separate and safe from that kind of, it's so... I know everyone listening knows it's evil, but it just...
It's this vile conflation of, like, children should have adults with whom they have a safe kind of intimacy that allows them to explore the world. Yeah. And then twisting that into children should be exploring their bodies with adults, which they should not be. Right? Like, it's this conflation. Like, no. Children need to have a healthy, intimate relationship with their parents or with the adults who are their caregivers, because that is how you have the security that allows you to go out into the world and meet it, right? Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, I think there's no way that handbook wasn't written by a pedophile trying to provide cover for himself and others like him. But a lot of these very dumb parents did not catch that. And worse, awkwardly tried to live up to this supposedly revolutionary standard. Some leftist thinkers, like Monica Seifert, a sociologist, were disturbed when the children in her Kinderladen did not attempt to have sex with the adults. She concluded the inhibitions and insecurities of the adults had likely forced those children to suppress their sexual curiosity. She saw this as a failure. And what's happening here is that you have in a lot of these kids, this is why I say most of these people are not pedophiles who have bought into this cooked shit, because, like, you have these attitudes that, like, well, these kids should feel confident sexually experimenting with adults. And it doesn't happen because that's not natural, right? Because the adults don't want it and neither do the kids. And the most cooked of these intellectuals, like Seifert, are like, well, clearly we have failed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea, I'm looking at the equation that someone wrote and it's not happening in real life. Therefore, real life is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is not a thing that happens between adults and children. It is a thing that has to be forced, which is proven, in fact, by this reaction, by how disappointed a lot of these academics and intellectuals are. Unfortunately, some of the parents were equally disappointed and took steps to stimulate their children. Again, these are not mostly pedophiles. So this behavior, they're not like actually abusing the kids physically, but instead they tell a lot of weird sex jokes, and they make a point to use words like cock and vagina constantly in front of kids. Schuller, who is like, this is kind of how Schuller's Kinderladen, they were like, well, we won't have children molest students, but instead we'll use sexual terminology around them a lot and tell weird jokes that make them uncomfortable. Schuller, looking back on this decades later, claims his kids, like, overall thought the Kinderladen was a good experience, but, quote, they thought the constant chatter about sex was horrible, because that's a normal way for children to feel about adults talking about that this way, right?
No, and pointing out that everything else, like, it was injected into this otherwise really interesting and radical idea that was otherwise good with this.
There's a clear problem in pedagogy in our society. Yeah, and it is interesting that, like, the kids were like, well, the stuff about, like, you know, going to protests, learning about politics, having kind of like non-authoritarian learning structure was great. I wish there hadn't been so many weird dick jokes. That was kind of bad. And I think the experience of Schuller's kids does thankfully represent a majority of the kids exposed to this system, which is more, what the fuck were our parents thinking, than like devastating trauma, right?
Yeah.
That is the norm. It's like, boy, that was weird. They were fucking cooked. Something was fucked up in their heads.
Yeah.
Like, because most of these kids were not molested, right? But between Schuller's kids and Ulrich, who is the boy who Kentler gave to a pedophile, there were a lot of children who still did suffer different degrees of abuse, right? Not as severe as like a kid being fostered with a child molester, but on that spectrum, right? Sophie Dannenberg was one of these children. Her parents were members of the German Communist Party, and they sent her to a Kinderladen in Gießen. As an adult, she interviewed her mother and other people from the Kinderladen and wrote about their experiences in a novel with the excellent title, The Pale Heart of the Revolution. Fleischhauer writes of this book, the material she used includes an account of a parents' evening where one of the mothers said that she stripped naked in front of her son so that he could inspect her. In the process, the woman spread her legs to expose her private parts for his inspection. The game ended when the boy stuck a pencil into his mother's vagina. The parents also spent a long time discussing whether it was a good idea to have sex with their own children so as to demonstrate the naturalness of sexual intercourse. Although the people Dannenberg interviewed did not recall any instances of physical advances, they did describe softer forms of sexual assault, such as pushy demands on children to show their naked bodies. In the novel, which is based on Dannenberg's research, the 8-year-old character Simone is told to strip in front of several adults and other children. Why do you want to hide yourself, the mother says, to the amusement of people standing around, when the child instinctively holds a pillow in front of her genitalia. It's a beautiful thing you have there. Show it to us. And abuse is the closest apt term to describe this.
Totally.
It doesn't quite describe how weird it is, right? But it's accurate enough. One author who studied this period, cited in Der Spiegel, states that objectively speaking, this behavior was child abuse, but writes kind of confusingly, subjectively it wasn't. And that's a weird statement. One I don't really agree with, but I want to continue Fleischhauer's quote describing it, right?
Okay.
As outlandish as it seems in retrospect, the parents apparently had the welfare of the children in mind, not their own. For the adherents to the new movement, the child did not serve as a sex object to provide the adults with a means of satisfying their sexual urges. This differentiates politically motivated abuse from pedophilia. And that's an interesting concept, politically motivated child abuse, right?
It's also not as much behind closed doors.
Right.
And so we actually probably weirdly know more about it than like the Catholic Church sex abuse or the Mother Winter.
Yeah. And
it makes me angry because that's a good name for a weird old,
Mother Winter. Yeah, it is. It's very, a lot of this is unfortunate. It's interesting to me kind of making that distinction that like, well, because what you get with a lot of this is these parents who are abusing their kids, don't like what they're doing, are personally uncomfortable with it, and feel bad that they don't feel better about doing it. Yeah,
because they're like, oh, it's because I'm bourgeois, but the next generation will be truly liberated.
They'll be over this. Yeah.
Fuck, cooked is the right word for...
Cooked is the right word. This is a problem you get all over the fucking map when it comes to radical politics. The Nazis were obviously trying to create a new kind of man, right? Yeah. They write about that constantly. there was also this concept of the new Soviet man, right?
Yeah.
And there's often left and right in radical politics this idea that like, in order to make the world that is possible, the better world that's possible, we have to remake people. And I kind of think you're always doomed and wrong if that's your goal, because people don't need to be remade. You have to meet people where they are and make their lives and thus the world better. And if your goal is to like change what people, if you think that's what you're doing, there's so much evil that will be justified as part of that process, no matter how good your goals are, right? Because it's a bad thing to want to do.
I know, and it's like it's still important to improve pedagogy. It's still important to raise kids less authoritarianly, and so that they're more inoculated against horrors. But not to. It's like the guy who puts the wheat into the cold to be like, it'll become cold tolerant if we freeze all the seeds. You know?
And it's the difference between saying, wow, for generations, parents wouldn't even hug their kids, and we wound up as Nazis. We should we were abusing our kids for generations, and we should find ways to raise them that are less abusive. And instead it's, we need to remake our children so that they can like remedy the sins of the past. Which are two different things. Saying that like we should not abuse kids the way that we were is different from saying we need to make different people, right? We need to be producing different kinds of people. Like, no,
that's actually really interesting, because it's like we're always, Gen Z is going to save us, and now it's already like, Gen A, is that what's next?
Finally, Gen Alpha, the Alphas have got it.
Yeah,
surely
like
they'll
they're
figure
the
this
truly
out.
woke, generation, and it's a little bit like. Well, that's getting ourselves off the hook. I objectively have fewer years left ahead of me probably, but then, so like maybe it's more on me than it is on the fucking youth.
Yeah. And maybe it's on people to figure out how to make the world better, and that's a better place to start than making people better. Yes. Right? Because if your goal is to make people better, you're usually going to do something terrible. You're usually going to do something terrible. If your goal is to make people better rather than help people, right? Yeah. That's the distinction. Totally. I want to help people. I want to make people better. One of those is fine. The other leads to this shit, Yeah. So anyway, when I think of politically motivated child abuse, I do think back to that book, To Train Up a Child.
I thought this was going to be an ad transition.
No, which is that like, it's that, when I think of politically motivated child abuse, I think of the Washington State Highway Patrol. No, not quite yet. But it is, I've always considered that book, To Train Up a Child, which is like, if you look to the Duggars, the IBLP, these like hard right-wing Christian organizations, it's their textbook for how to beat your children to make them better.
Okay.
I do kind of wonder. I always just saw that as simple child abuse. Is it more accurate to describe that as politically motivated child abuse? I don't know. It's a bigger topic.
Oh, yeah, because maybe they don't even... Because hitting your kid because you're angry, or even hitting your kid because, oh, crap, my kid is about to run out into the street and I can't think of anything else to do.
This is the only tool I have in my head. Yeah.
Right. So those are both motivated by something different. But versus like, I am neglectful of my duty as a father unless I solemnly and sadly hit my child with a rod. That's interesting.
And I know kids who were like quiverful, who were raised in the religious right, who is like, that's part of what broke us out is my parents didn't like doing that, didn't like the discipline. And so I do think it's actually useful to look at a lot of the child abuse that does occur on the right through this is politically motivated child abuse lens, right? Yeah. I actually think that might be really important. It didn't really occur to me until I started reading about these weird German leftists and their ideas of like sex liberation. But anyway, one of the most famous abusers within this system, this like Kinderladen system, this sort of like shit that's coming out of the German left in this period, was Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a Green Party politician who was a student leader during a May of 1968 protest in France and was co-president of the European Greens European Free Alliance in the EU Parliament. He was a critic of Stalinism and an advocate of libertarian socialism. And part of why I'm bringing him up is we've talked about the communists who are cooked, and it is not just the communists who are cooked. I know,
Margaret. I was so excited for it to just be the communists, but I wasn't surprised.
Plenty of anarchists have this kind of like fucking ideological cookedness weirdness to them.
Absolutely.
In 1975, Daniel wrote an autobiographical book that described his experience as a Kinderladen teacher. On several occasions, he claimed children opened his fly and stroked his penis. Quote, I was usually quite taken aback. My reactions varied depending on the circumstances. Now, I was not sure whether to classify him as, is this a politically motivated abuser or just a pedophile, until I read this transcript of a recording that surfaced in 2013. And this is Daniel talking. At 9 a.m, I join my 8 little toddlers between the ages of 16 months and 2 years. I wash their butts. I tickle them. They tickle me and we cuddle. You know, a child's sexuality is a fantastic thing. You have to be honest and sincere. With the very young kids, it isn't the same as it is with the 4 to 6-year-old kids. When a little 5-year-old girl starts undressing, it's great because it's a game. It's an incredibly erotic game.
Oh my fucking God.
That's a pedophile. That's a pedophile. That's
Launch
just a
that
pedophile.
man into the sun.
Yeah, that's just a straight up pedophile, right?
Yeah.
When this blew up, Daniel claimed that what he had been writing was just fiction meant to provoke people. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. This is all tied into like why the part of why it's not, I'm not going to say it's a major part, but it's not an insignificant part of like the rise of groups like AfD in Germany right now. Cause a lot of this shit came out very recently and has like blown up support for some of these left wing parties. Like this has done damage recently and provided ammunition to the right in Germany recently.
That's fair.
Because people are furious when they learned out that this was happening, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Pedophiles who abuse children are predators, and predators inherently seek to escalate their behavior. As the 70s turned into the 80s, some of these pedophiles who had been camouflaging themselves as child care reform activists decided to make a grand play for acceptance, following in the wake of the gay rights movement. Organizations like the Indian Commune in Nuremberg sought to characterize pedophilia as a sexual orientation that deserved to be treated with respect. Now, in true German fashion, the Indian Commune was both an act of cultural appropriation and mind-numbing abuse. Germans, we've talked about this in our very first episodes on Karl May, there's this weird obsession with Native Americans that is based almost entirely in the fiction of a guy who never went to America and just lied about Native Americans.
Yeah.
And it influenced the Nazis loved. Like Hitler was a huge, was this kind of weird Native American stand where he was not actually standing any real history, just like what this German author, but he thought he was. And there's still a lot of weirdness around Native Americans in German society today. This is one example of it, right? The Indian Commune is a group of adults and children who painted each other up like Native Americans, or like their conception of Native Americans, and showed up at that year's Green Party convention to argue in favor of free sex for adults and children. Almost unbelievably, the Greens gave them a hearing. More than that, in 1985, the Greens state organization in Westphalia argued that nonviolent sexual contact between adults and children should be decriminalized. Another state Green Party published a position paper making the same argument until public protest forced them to remove it. Again, we're in the 80s by now, so there's pushback to this.
Yeah.
This movement had a name, the pedosexual movement, and it succeeded for a while because a lot of non-pedophiles bought their bullshit. But the driving force behind it was always highly placed, influential pederasts. In the Green Party, one of these pedophiles was Hermann Meer, a leader in the party who lived on a commune that openly advertised engaging in pedophilia. One victim later told the magazine Die Welt that Meer abused him along with, quote, about 10 men, many of whom were visitors to the commune who seemed to have shown up for that purpose, right? This is a place you can, it's so vile. Another pedophile leader of the pedosexual movement was Peter Schult, an anarchist journalist who described himself as a pederast and was convicted of bringing a girl into his house to abuse in 1976. Schult denied the allegations and claimed that he was being punished for his sexuality and political organizing. He attracted a great deal of support, and in 1977 he wrote an angry pamphlet attacking anarchists who hadn't supported him. He described them as preaching anarchy while being offended at the sight of lived anarchy, in his words.
I am glad that there were enough anarchists who were mad at him that he had to write that.
That he had to write a paper.
That's the only thing I'm proud of in any of this story is that people were like, what the fuck?
It's one of those things where like Schult denied the allegations that he had molested a girl in part because he was molesting boys. And maybe those specific allegations were wrong, but he talks about molesting boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Like Kentler, Schultz defended his molestation of boys by claiming he was just helping runaways. And here is what gay historian Hubert Kennedy wrote in Schultz's obituary. Peter found and took home the homeless, or they found him. In state institutions, his address was passed from one boy to another as a place where runaways could find temporary shelter. His address was also well known to the authorities, whose authority the anarchist Peter refused to recognize. And he was sent to prison numerous times on charges of drug possession and seducing minors. A number of left-wing publications were unfortunately, woefully open to the arguments of pedosexual advocates. Tageszeitung, an alt-weekly publication, published interviews with pedophiles where they discussed how wonderful their sex with little boys was. When G.D. Hensel, co-founder of the paper, argued that they should not be promoting pedophilia, she was described as being a prude and told, quote, "There's no such thing as censorship in the Tageszeitung." Like, basically, we don't censor people from talking about molesting children.
This is a problem in American left, too. I'm not sure if you're going to get into this. During the same time period, you know? It's a big problem.
We're not enough. Again, when we talked about Thornley, we did. And we've talked on other shows about an influential anarchist. Oh, God, what's his fucking name? The Taz guy.
Peter Lamborn Wilson.
Peter Lamborn Wilson, Hakeem Bey, who was also... may not have actually molested. I don't know if he ever actually molested anyone, but argued in favor of it.
Yeah, I'm under the impression of him arguing in favor because it was in vogue, and it's interesting because it's during this dead period of organizing. I mean, there is some organizing happening, but by and large, the anti-authoritarian left is not doing a lot during the 70s and 80s because, it just was going through a slump. You know?
Yeah.
And so the only people around, I mean, they're not the only people around. There are many people who are against this all along.
Yes. And we're about to talk about those.
Great.
So there are leftists in Germany who speak out against this real big problem. One of them is Gunther Ament, a social scientist who argued accurately there is no equitable sexuality between children and adults.
Yeah.
Another person
on
the right side of this. There's no
non-violent sexuality between children and adults.
It's inherently violent for an adult to rape a kid, right?
Yeah.
Alice Schwarzer, who founded a women's magazine, also lambasted acceptance of pedophilia on the left. From Der Spiegel, quote, Ament recalls how he was disparaged as a reactionary in flyers and articles. There was an outright campaign against Alice and me at the time, he says. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that this horrific episode came to an end. In 1994, the pedos appearing in Tageszeitung for the last time, and even that publication recognized that intercourse with little boys was no different than with little girls, who, thanks to the women's movement, have long been deemed worthy of protection. And that's a worthwhile note on this, is that when we talk about these people supporting sexual contact with kids from adults, a lot of them, in the Kinderladen movement, it's this broader, we just need to be more open to kids' sexuality for both boys and girls. When it comes to pairing abused children with pedophiles, both officially through the state, as happened with Kentler, and kind of unofficially, like that anarchist we talked about did, it's all little boys, because there's a broader understanding that the feminist movement has already pushed through this understanding that that's not acceptable to do with little girls.
Right.
And it took later for boys, right? And some of this is wrapped up in a lot of really complicated shit about the suppression of male homosexuals in Germany and throughout the West, and how common relationships between much older and much younger men, were. This is a messy topic, right?
Yeah.
But it is kind of worth noting that part of what brings this to an end is when folks start arguing that we already agree it is wrong to molest little girls. Why are we treating boys differently? Right. It does come out of this feminist movement. A lot of the backlash to this that finally succeeds in bringing an end to it.
Could you imagine that that's you're a feminist during this time and that's what you have to waste?
I have to argue this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, oh boy. Speaking of arguing, Margaret, you know what I love to argue in favor of?
Commercial enterprise through advertisement.
That's right. In this case, it's a welcome relief from talking about leftist German
Palate
politics.
Cleanser.
And we're back. And speaking of back, let's get back to the story of Dr. Helmut Kentler and his plan to pair foster kids with pedophiles. This continued all through the 1980s, even after the pedosexual movement faded in popularity thanks to belated resistance from within the left. The best documented victim of Kentler's specific program was a boy named Marco. In 1988, Marco was crossing the street alone when he was hit by a car. This was a minor incident. He was not severely injured, thankfully, but his injury, the fact that he was not attended, right, drew the attention of a local youth welfare office, which was also run by the Berlin government. From the New Yorker, quote, caseworkers at the office observed that Marco's mother seemed unable to give him the necessary emotional attention. She worked at a sausage stand and was struggling to manage parenthood on her own. Marco's father, a Palestinian refugee, had divorced her. She sent Marco and his older brother to daycare in dirty clothes and left them there for 11 hours. Caseworkers recommended that Marco be placed in a foster home with a family-like atmosphere. One described him as an attractive boy who was wild but very easy to influence. Hinkle, a 47-year-old single man who supplemented his income as a foster father by repairing jukeboxes and other electronics. Marco was Hinkle's 8th foster son in 16 years. When Hinkle began fostering children in 1973, a teacher noted that he was always looking for contact with boys, Hinkle specifically. Now again, this is as a result of the program that Kentler has instituted. Kentler is in contact with Hinkle. Marco has 2 parents. Both of them are in his life. They're separated, but his dad, the Palestinian refugee, is in his life, and so is his mom. They are both just poor. And so as a result, they're scrambling to make enough money to get by, which means there are times when this kid is not watched as much as would be ideal, right? The state takes him away from them for that, probably in part because there's a lot of writing about how, like, once they see his dad, they're like, well, we have to keep him away from this dangerous Muslim, right? Like this authoritarian influence, right? Mm-hmm. It's really, really fucked up. So people in the Senate and educational offices within the Berlin city government were well aware that Hinkle was a pedophile adopting boys, 8 boys by the time he fosters Marco, right? They don't stop any of this. This is when I talk about guys like Kentler being like, well, some kids are in such desperate straits that being with a pedophile is best for them. This is what they mean. Well, this kid's mom and dad are separated and they're not people like us. Yeah, they're
one of them's Muslim.
So it must be better for him to be raped repeatedly, right? That is the calculation they're making.
Yeah.
In 1989, a caseworker wrote that Hinkle was in a, quote, homosexual relationship with one of his foster sons, possibly Marco. A prosecutor, and again, this is not a relationship. Right. I'm not calling it. That is what the caseworker calls it in 1989. A prosecutor did call for an investigation, but Helmut Kentler, who described himself as Hinkle's permanent advisor and also called Hinkle regularly to talk politics, intervened. Kentler described himself to this prosecutor as the, quote, nation's chief authority on questions of sexual education. And at this point, he was famous. He is regularly interviewed in the news. He is consulted by political leaders. He is a prominent and respected academic. He sends a letter on university letterhead to this prosecutor, issuing an expert opinion on Hinkle, saying, I've gotten to know this guy well through a research project we're both engaged in. Hinkle is a wonderful parent, and he attacks the wild interpretation of this psychologist who had accused him of pederasty. The threats of an investigation went away. Several times a year, Hinkle would drive to see Kentler at the school where he taught. Kentler would study the children and take notes. He was happy enough with Hinkle that he kept a ready stream of boys heading into the pedophile's home. After Marco had been there 18 months, he was joined by a kid named Sven, who had been found at age 7 begging for money in a subway station. The youth welfare office noted that since he'd likely never experienced a positive parent-child relationship, he was a good candidate for Kentler's program.
Because he's not going to get one now, so...
The solutions to both of these kids' problems, to the extent that Marco had a problem, the solution was, well, yeah, there should have been some sort of social welfare net to ensure that his mom didn't have to work these long shifts at the sausage factory so that she had more time for her kids. There should be like state-funded daycare and stuff. There should be programs. The same thing with there's a homeless kid begging for money. You know what we should do? Get him off the street and not into a pedophile's house, right? Like, these are not complex problems. We're not talking about like intractable issues of geopolitics.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to quote again from the New Yorker. The two boys took on different roles in their new family. Sven was the good son, docile and loving. Marco was more defiant, but at night, when Hinkle came into his room asking to cuddle or waiting for him while he brushed his teeth before bed, he had to comply. I just accepted it out of loyalty because I didn't know anything else, Marco told me. I didn't think what was happening was good, but I thought it was normal. I thought of it a little bit like food. People have different tastes in food, the way some people have different tastes in sexuality. If Sven's bedroom door was open and he wasn't there, Marco knew what was happening, but the two boys never talked about what Hinkle did to them. It was an absolutely taboo subject, Marco said. One day, Marco took a knife from the kitchen and slept with it under his pillow. When Hinkle approached his bed and discovered the blade, he withdrew quickly, and he called Helmut Kentler, and he then handed the phone to Marco. Kentler asked him why he had brought the knife into his bed, and Marco said, "There's a devil behind my wall." Kentler had a calming, grandfatherly presence. He assured Marco that there was no such thing as devils, and Marco agreed to surrender the knife. Never give up your knife, kids. Never, ever give up your fucking knife.
Well, it's interesting because it compares to how we talked about demons in our head last week's episodes, you know? Like, there's ways that people are going to conceptualize the abuse that they're suffering.
It's something almost so awful you have to turn it into a metaphor because you can't even you can't even look at it directly, even though it's happening to you.
Yeah. I got really excited for where that story could have gone.
I know. It's heartbreaking. It would be great if this ended with a pedophile being stabbed to death, but it does not.
I know. And then it's like, and also like most of the time, it's like, then you're like, you want that kid to have to have done that. And then you're like, well, that kid's life isn't going to get better.
This is bad stuff. I will say, this is a happy ending. This is a legit, Marco's story has a legitimately wonderful ending. So that is good. I want to promise you that now because we have some more bad stuff to get through.
Yeah, okay.
So Marco still has a family. He has a mother and father. They visit sometimes. Again, they're separated, but like they visit both separately and together, and they try to get him back. But Hinkle has all the power. He would cancel visits at will minutes before they were set to begin, or he would end them early, often claiming that Marco's mother was disruptive to Marco's emotional state. The stress and drama Hinkle created around these visits caused Marco to wet his bed and fail to focus at school. And Kentler used this as an excuse to end the visits entirely, telling the welfare office that Marco's educational successes are ruined by seeing his mom. Marco's Palestinian father was not allowed to visit at all because Hinkle told authorities that Marco said he'd been beaten by his father. We have I think Marco has said that this was not true, but like he is backing up anything Hinkle says because Hinkle is his caregiver. And as he states, I didn't know I could disagree with him about stuff, right? Now, there are times that authorities saw through these lies. One of the mandated child therapists that Marco saw described Hinkle as holding the boy prisoner during their sessions. Several different mandated therapists complained, but anytime stuff started to move in a way where like maybe the kids would be taken away from Hinkle, Kentler would swoop in. He told the youth welfare office they were not qualified to assess a child who was as damaged as Marco. If an assessment was needed, only Kentler was established enough to do it.
Yeah. The cops can investigate themselves.
Right, exactly. He acknowledged that Hinkle could appear harsh and hurtful, but this was not so. Quote, I ask you to consider that a man who deals with such seriously damaged children is not a simple person. What Mr. Hinkle needs from the authorities is trust and protection. It is the cop argument. What they're dealing with is so dangerous and vile that they have to use extreme measures. And we're not qualified to question them, right? It is, anytime you hear that logic, it means someone is doing something terrible.
Yeah.
Marco's parents spent years trying to get him back. This is not something he realizes as an adult. Oh my God, I was not abandoned. My parents fought for me. These two poor people, one of whom is a Palestinian refugee, were basically ranged against the entire power of the city government of Berlin, which was being effectively wielded by this weird pedophile philosopher against them. You know?
Yeah.
There is a court case. Hinkle coaches Marco to tell the judge that he wanted to stay with his foster father, who he called Papa. Marco claims, I didn't really know what was going on. I did not understand that my parents were fighting to have a connection to me. I thought that they had basically abandoned me, and I was scared of angering Hinkle and also traumatized from the near nightly abuse, right?
Yeah.
There was one bright spot in his childhood, which is that, and it's a weird one, it's that this again, pedophile who is fostering him gets a third foster son. This foster son is a disabled little boy named Marcel. Now, the fact that Henkel, the pedophile, sought to take possession of a boy who could not walk or talk is horrifying in ways that I cannot describe and will not labor on. But Marco and Sven came to love Marcel and treat him as their own blood. They took care of this boy, because he was their brother. From the New Yorker, Marco and Sven became Kramer's caretakers, feeding him strawberry-flavored milk with a spoon and removing mucus from his lungs with a suction hose. When they went to Henkel's house in Brandenburg, west of Berlin, Marco pushed Kramer for hours on a tire swing. Kramer was the first person in years for whom Marco had felt love. Now, the fact that both of these kids being so profoundly abandoned and abused, when they see this disabled boy who is in desperate need of not just medical care, but attention, provide it, is a wonderful bit of light in this, right?
Yeah.
Marco struggles with school, obviously. And part of this is because Henkel is encouraging him to neglect his studies and misbehave, right? Because the worse Marco does in school, the more they have an excuse. They switch schools every year, which means that no adults get to spend enough time around Marco to realize what is going on. Henkel is a very effective and methodical abuser, and that's what's going on here. His tactics work until Marco goes through puberty and starts lifting weights. One night, when Henkel came to molest him, Marco fought back, not even a lot, but that spelled the end of him being molested forever. Henkel, of course, still responds aggressively to this in his own way. He would lock the kitchen at night. He justified it to Kentler by claiming that Marco was greedy. You know, he would fight back, but he did not keep molesting Marco.
Right, because he was afraid of him.
Because he was afraid of him now. Now, here's where things get complicated. When Marco turns 18, you might expect him to have gotten the hell out of the house, but he doesn't. He lives with Henkel for 3 more years. He says part of this is that he didn't even consider leaving to be possible. Quote, "It's very hard to describe, but I was never raised to think critically about anything. I had an empty mind." Those are his words. He says this, but there is a very clear reason he stayed with Henkel, which is that his beloved adopted brother is living there too. Marcel is there. Marco willingly stays in the house of his abuser for 3 years so that he can continue to be a caregiver to his brother. This only ends when Marcel dies after a 48-hour flu. Marco says he always checked on his brother multiple times throughout the night to make sure he was breathing, so he noticed very quickly that something was wrong. He tried to get Henkel to call for an ambulance, but Henkel did not want any of the boys going to doctors, and so Marcel died while Marco watched. Quote, "I was looking into his eyes when he died." Now, this does not prompt an investigation into Henkel. Marcel was an abandoned disabled child and was thus of less than no value to the Youth Welfare Office. His file simply noted, "Call from Mr. Henkel, who said Marcel died unexpectedly last night. Previously, there were no signs of an infection." The following note says that Henkel, now 60, wanted to adopt another boy. So, talking about how long this goes, Marcel dies in 2001. Kentler's experiment is still going into the 21st century.
Yeah, 2001 felt very, Yeah. That's too recent.
Kentler is a respected figure at this moment. This only starts to change when an academic, Teresa Nentwig, began researching and writing about Kentler for her thesis. She had struggled to find good information on this pedophile foster program and noticed that most of the files were missing from the city archives because they had been deliberately removed. Kentler died in 2008, but even after that point, he had loyal friends still in government and academia, and they fought back against her attempts to expose him. Eventually, her university contract was canceled, and she blames this on the fact that she chose to research Kentler. She eventually wrote a book on the man, which revealed that he was not just some wild-eyed academic who bought into bogus science. He was also a pedophile. Kentler, a single man, adopted 3 sons and fostered several more children. 2 of his foster sons have accused him of sexual abuse. They initially went to Karen Deseret, an author and researcher who, quote, owed a lot to Kentler and thus referred the boys to another therapist rather than do anything when they came out to her. She claims the boys themselves wanted the abuse kept quiet because they, quote, didn't want to lose the positives of Kentler's care, that they had enough to eat and that they were taken care of and things like that. I'm going to read another quote from that New Yorker article about kind of the collapse of Kentler's reputation. Gunter Schmidt, a former president of the International Academy of Sex Research, which attracts the field's leading researchers, was friends with Kentler for more than 20 years. I honestly had respect for it, he told Nitwig of the experiment, because I thought, these are really young people who are in the worst situation. They probably have a long history at home. They had miserable childhoods, and someone is looking after them. And if Kentler is there, it'll be fine, he added. And the Berlin Senate is also there. When Kentler was 57, he wrote Schmidt a letter explaining why he was aging happily rather than becoming lonely and resigned. He and his 26-year-old son were, quote, part of a very fulfilling love story that had lasted 13 years and still felt fresh. To understand his state of mind, Kentler wrote, his friends should know his secret. Kentler seems to have reappraised his belief that pedophiles were good caregivers to abandoned children in 1991, after that adopted son that he had bragged about having a good relationship with committed suicide. Now, It's unclear to me if Kentler, this is still a bit of a mystery to me, how much of this was like, he's in this ideological space, and how much of this is he was always a pedophile? I really don't know with Kentler. Because he claims to have recognized that there was he had made errors in his beliefs around this stuff after his adopted son and abuse victim commits suicide. He would later claim that during the 90s, he reads this essay by a Hungarian psychoanalyst, Sandor Ferenczi, that changed his mind on pedophilia. Ferenczi wrote that sexual relationships between adults and children were always exploitative and dangerous for children. After his son's suicide, Kentler cited this paper often, but never admitted to molesting his own adopted children. He simply said that his child had been molested by his birth mother and committed suicide due to that. And,
So he's just avoiding responsibility.
That's how I interpret this, yeah. And there's definitely a period after which he claims to have recognized that, this was wrong, that he's still in contact with Henkel, right? And still actively helping him to continue to abuse kids. So
yeah,
I don't buy Kentler's story here.
No, this is not enough of a turning around to any kind of redemption arc,
No. The happiest ending I can give you is to continue the story of Marco. When he left Henkel's home at age 21, he had nothing and nowhere to live. He spent nights homeless, sleeping on benches, before a charity for homeless youth found him a subsidized apartment. Henkel had done so little to educate him that Marco didn't know that people had to pay for electricity. He stumbled through life for a while, picking up the basics of survival, but stuck in what he describes as a sort of hibernation. After 5 years, he began to feel as if he were a monster due to his lack of empathy and destructive outbursts. This culminated in a fight on a Berlin train when he noticed 3 men staring at him and just beat the shit out of them, sending one man to the ER. Mm-hmm. Marco was horrified by himself, and the way he interprets this is like, I am turning into Henkel, who abused me. And he made a commitment to change. Not long after this, he was walking down the street when a woman, a photographer, complimented his appearance and asked, do you want to do any modeling for me? Right? So he sat for some photos with her, and this didn't lead to any modeling work, but he becomes friends with this woman, and he starts to meet other people through her, and he gets a friend group, right?
Yeah.
He describes the experience of learning how to have friends as similar to learning a foreign language through immersion in another culture, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, Marco met a woman. They got married, had children, and today he is a devoted father and family man. His very life is proof that Kentler and the other experts in the child psychology of the era were wrong. Abused children are not condemned to a life where the only people who might care for them are pedophiles, right? People can recover from the most traumatic things imaginable if they are provided with the support and love necessary to enable healing. And thankfully, Marco was. He makes friends. He develops relationships that are equal relationships with other adults, and he heals himself, right? Becomes a father, and it's the best possible ending that this guy has. And there's even this coda he gets when all of this stuff starts to come out, around 2018. Marco is contacted by a guy who works for Alternative for Deutschland, Germany's far-right party, as an advisor for education and cultural policy. And this guy, Schwer, reads about Marco in a Der Spiegel article in 2018 about Kentler's experiment. And he's like, he starts basically offering help from the AFD. He claimed it's not for political purposes, but like to really help him get justice from the parliament, right? To like get some money out of them.
So that he could be a poster boy for the far right. No.
And that is what happened for a while, right? The AFD holds Stop Kentler's sex ed rallies to protest the way that sexuality is taught in German schools. Mm-hmm. They argue that Kentler's criminal pedophile spirit lives on unbroken in today's sexual education. While this is going on, Marco is taking this guy's help for a while, and eventually the German Senate authorizes 50,000 euro payouts to Marco and Sven, and I think to a couple of other abuse victims of Kentler's experiment. This is like, it's not common for there to be compensation for damages in significant amounts in Germany in the same way it is in the US. This is like seen as a significant amount. After the Senate makes this basically, and the Senate apologizes, right? So not only do they give money, they're like, this was bad. This was a fuck up. Christopher Schweer, the AFD advisor, advises Marco and Sven to keep fighting at this point, to like basically be posters for this movement where you're arguing kind of everything about sex ed in Germany is based in Kentler and that's evil. Marco is like, well, I don't understand why I would do that. Like, we've got our wishes. There's no point in continuing to like fight the Senate. They did the thing that we wanted them to do. Yeah. Quote from the New Yorker, but Schweer kept pushing him, Marco said. Schweer denies this. Then I slowly got suspicious. That's Marco. I asked myself, what else should I want? That's when I got the feeling that the AFD just wants to use me, to play me up. And I said, I don't want to be a political tool. I don't want to get pulled into an election campaign. And it's just like, it's remarkable to me, like, how fucking dope this guy is. Like, how strong you have to be to, like, make yourself into the man he became, given what was done to him. It's a really remarkable story.
Yeah.
So I guess this Bastards episode ended with a cool person who did cool stuff.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Marco.
Yeah.
Oh. How are we feeling at the end of this all, Margaret?
I actually feel, okay, so I expected to just feel absolutely awful. And it's not just, it helps that I really appreciated you ending with something a little positive, but also I like learned a lot in terms of, instead of just like, oh, there's some bad people and they do bad stuff, right? Instead, there's this thing that every ideology, like even in this, where you're talking about like the left and the liberal government are two different ideologies, right? And both of these stories have had like pedophilia injected into them and then baked into an ideological structure. And one of them is the ideological structure of the foster care system. And the other is of the like kindergarten system of radicals or whatever. And so it's just like every ideology across the board, if there's a way that pedophiles can try to interject their awful nightmare ideas into it, they like will and do. And so I appreciate watching that stop. I appreciate that like feminist discourse was able to interject and say, hey, this is actually bad. And then like, and it's interesting because you mentioned the maybe Austrian or Czech or something, the guy who wrote the essay that was like, actually you can't have any consensual relations.
Who was that? One sec. Hungarian psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi.
And so,
or Ferenczi. Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like, because I became an adult after that paper was written, I sort of take it for granted that, well, don't we know that? You know, but I'm like, I guess
this have been obvious.
Yeah. And I'm like, it somehow wasn't. And I try not to always sit in judgment of the people of the past, but there's like some stuff where like slavery and pedophilia where I'm like,
that was
people
wrong and bad.
And lots of people knew it, you know, and actually slavery is like a weirdly comparable thing where like everyone's like every ideology came up with a way to make it okay. And then people of every ideology were like, well, except certain ideologies that were just pro-slavery or whatever. But like overall, people were like, I don't think you can like own a guy. And people are like, the Bible says you can own a guy. And other people will be like, well, the Bible says fight to stop evil, and you're evil.
I'm going to pick these paragraphs and not those ones, right? Yeah. I'm going to pick the theorists on the left who I'm going to pick the academic Teresa Nentwig who lost a position in academia because she wanted to expose Kentler and not Kentler, this is why, again, you're rooting. If you're rooting everything in ideology to the point where you can't see anything else, it makes you vulnerable to this sort of thing. There should be. You need your own personal, not to, I don't know, the U.S. government, the way we do things, obviously there's a lot of flaws, but one of the things that provides some protection is that we have a Bill of Rights. And you kind of have to have a personal bill of what are my lines? Politically, totally. Morally, what's not, it's like how I have a personal line that if you're killing children, I don't care why you're justifying it. Yeah. I don't care if your political cause is righteous. I don't care if they're the Tsar's kids. You shouldn't kill kids. That's the Tsar's kids lines.
Were the people I thought of immediately. In that case.
That's one of my lines. Yeah, don't kill children.
And it gets into this awkward thing where overall I'm pretty pro Nat Turner, and then I'm like, well, there's this thing where I would have disagreed strongly.
Yeah,
with Nat Turner.
think. I would argue he was in a position where it was not possible for him to really take better actions because of what slavery does to people. Yeah.
I think that's completely fair, and I am not I'm not coming out against Nat Turner, but
his desperation was they were not going to win, and what do you do then? What do you do? Do you stop that? I don't know. This is all. These things are messy. Morality is messy, but it's also easy to hold a line that says, I don't think it's okay to kill kids. I don't think adults should be fucking kids. These are not acceptable behaviors. Child rape is not acceptable. Child murder is not acceptable. My politics have to agree with my morals because those are removable, right?
Right. And there's the difference between using an ideological label as your definition versus your description. Right. I have a set of things that I believe in. And those things map closest for me to what I would call anarchism, right?
Yeah.
But it's not, I don't sit there at the end of the day and think, well, as an anarchist, what should I do? I think as me and what I believe, what do I do? And so if the label doesn't, that's not what's important here. I don't pick, even as a trans girl or whatever, I don't wake up in the morning and be like, what does a trans girl do? I'm like, no, I do what I do. And then the closest gender label to what I do in my own head is trans girl. And
that is
we get so caught up in it.
I think a root of when we talk about these, the kind of middle part of these very uncomfortable episodes where all of these German parents who were uncomfortable with sexualizing their children, but thought they had to for ideological reasons. And when I read about people doing that, it's oh, well, you don't know who you are.
Yeah,
that's why you were. You had no idea who you were, right?
Totally.
You took on this ideology because it comfortingly gave you an identity, but you hadn't figured out the person that you were. You were using your ideology as an excuse to not do that, and that is that makes you vulnerable to stuff like this. You do, even when you realize how clearly certain things politically are obvious, are obviously right, are obviously wrong. That's not an excuse to not figure out who you are.
Yeah. Well, and then the people who are against, because right now in the US discourse, the people who are so actively against and militantly against pedophilia, the people who are claiming that are often these far right people who are actually against me existing and giving talks in public because I wear a dress or something. Right.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, people are then becoming useful idiots because I listen to everything you're saying and I'm like, man, I sure wouldn't be sad if someone broke into that man's house and shot him to death.
No, that would have been dope.
Yeah. But it's
several men in this story should have been murdered.
Yeah, absolutely. And and what's hard is that, but you can also convince people that people need to get murdered as if they are the same as that thing. This is part of why it's so aggravating when they're they conflated it with the Green Party conflating it with homosexuality. And so people are it's conflated. So kill all the gays. And no, stop pedophilia. And if violence is necessary to stop it, I don't care, but it's so, I don't know.
I think this is as we deal with, as we talked about at the end of this, like the really bad faith right wing sort of how they make use of this while ignoring their own complicity in child molestation, which is constant both in religious organizations and in stuff like Christian organizations lobbying for child marriage, right? Which is the norm in the US. Fucking Ted Cruz is a big fan of children being able to get married, and that's supporting a kind of pedophilia. It is. Yes. Politically motivated abuse, you know, in the same way that these fucked up leftists are. But the fact that the right does this and has in the current period more political success doing this sort of thing doesn't mean we can ignore this history, because like it's important, not just maybe we will never again have influential pedophiles on the left, you know, we can pushing through this kind of politics into like actual action. Maybe. I don't know that I think that's like, but there will be, and currently is in fact, other things, right? This is why you have to like have certain immovable moral beliefs about what's okay to do to people, and why you also have to be willing to like those academics we talked about who endured that harassment campaign when they were like, well, obviously it's wrong to rape children, right? Yeah. They had zines made about them being evil, you know? Yeah. You've got that fucking anarchist journalist being like, these other anarchists who don't like what I'm doing, they don't really believe in lived anarchy, you know? Yeah. Like, oh, you know what? If I thought that was true, if I thought anarchy meant that, I wouldn't be an anarchist anymore. Absolutely and I would fight them. Not. Yes, of course.
The important thing here isn't the label.
Yeah. But to the people for whom the important thing is the label, hearing something like that can be a thought terminating phrase, right? Yeah. You're not practicing lived anarchy. Well, then you stop thinking about what the actual issue is. It's like, well, this guy's molesting homeless kids, right? Then you start to think about like, well, ideologically, where am I on that? No. Just hit the guy. Right. You know, like you're good.
Totally. Yeah. Like free knives for the homeless kids.
Yeah. Free knives for homeless kids.
Yeah. I tell you, I never met anyone who practiced stabbing more than when I was a teenage street kid, and one of my friends was a teenage sex working street kid. That kid was stabby, and he probably learned to be. I hope he is alive and well.
Yep. And I hope he still has a knife, you know?
But if you want to read about can I have an awful segue into my...
Yes. No. Great.
Yeah. If you want to read about teenagers learning to find themselves and using medieval weaponry, I have when I say YA book, it's actually a crossover book. It's a book that admits that its audience is also adults. And it's called The Sapling Cage, and it is coming out from Feminist Press in September, but it is being kickstarted in June, and you can sign up now on the Kickstarter for more information about it. And Robert read it, and so therefore it has to be good.
It's a fucking great book. A lot of good spear talk in it, which I'm always a fan of. We need to re-normalize the use of spears as a personal defense weapon.
You know, the way in which some people in street demonstrations use long poles is a very similar thing. Spears are very good at making space.
Yeah, you need to be phalanx maxing with your friends and colleagues, right? Yeah. You know, you need to be protecting, covering each other with your shield arm, moving as a unit, learning how to wheel on command, and preparing to face cavalry charges. These are the kind of things that the kids need to be into these days.
All of those things happen in 2024 America. Watch out for the Cossacks.
Watch out for the Cossacks. They're still around, and they're not the original Cossacks. Those guys are actually fighting the Russians right now.
Yeah, those guys
anyway, good stuff.
Behind the Bastards is a production of Cool Zone Media. For more from Cool Zone Media, visit our website, coolzonemedia.com, or check us out on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.